Okay, so thank you for joining me today. We have Dr. Ed Spevak from the St. Louis Zoo. Dr. Spevak has dedicated decades of his career to the conservation of invertebrates and vertebrates, working in zoos and aquariums as a zoo curator and small population biologist. Ed is the curator of invertebrates at the St. Louis Zoo and the director of St. Louis Zoo Wildcare Institute Center for Native Pollinator Conservation. Whew. Ed and the St. Louis Zoo helped to establish the IUCN SSC Bumblebee Specialist Group, now the Wild Bee Specialist Group, which sounds so fun. Ed and the zoo also helped establish the Honeybee Health Coalition, Farmers for Monarchs and Missourians for Monarchs Collaborative. Ed, through the CNPC, has developed a program called Native Foods, Native Peoples, Native Pollinators, focused on food security, food sovereignty, and pollinator conservation with Native American reservations and communities. Through this program, Ed has worked with tribes and nations from Montana to Oklahoma, assisting them with food production, education, outreach on pollinators, biodiversity, and agriculture, and supporting habitat restoration for pollinators and other wildlife. Ed is also co-leader of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, AZA, SAFE, Saving Animals from Extinction, and the North American Bison Program working with indigenous groups. For example, Intertribal Buffalo Council, International Buffalo Relations Institute, Indigenous Led, and Tonka Fund, conservation organizations, and other zoos to rematriate bison populations for ecocultural restoration. So that's a lot. Dr. Spevak has done a lot. And I'm really excited about this talk that focuses on bison and pollinators. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ed Spevak.
Thank you very much. I will start by sharing my screen and my presentation. And hopefully you can all see that. Okay. So thank you very much for having me. Talking about bison, talking about bees and pollinators are kind of two of my favorite things nowadays. So, but before I get started, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that the St. Louis Zoo is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Osage Nation and Illini Confederacy. We also acknowledge that this area and parts of Missouri have been traditionally used by others, including the Pawnee, Sac and Fox, Dakota, Lakota, Oto, Missouri, Omaha, Iowa, Quapaw, Chickasaw, Kickapoo, and the Haudenosaunee. The process of knowing and acknowledging the ground beneath our feet is a way of honoring and expressing gratitude for the people of this land before us. It familiarizes visitors with the cultures and histories of Missouri's indigenous tribes, as well as with their ties in the St. Louis region. We honor our heritage of Native peoples and what they teach us about stewardship of the earth. So today, I'm going to talk about bison and their role in helping pollinators, something we don't really tend to think about. We may think about grasses, we may think about prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets, but with bison, they're also incredibly important for pollinators. So first off, I want to give you a little bit of background on pollinators. So first off, about 90% of our flowering plants, and that's estimated to be eventually around 400,000 species, depend to some extent on animal pollination. And 75% of our crop species worldwide also require pollinators. Now, pollinators are very diverse. There are wasps, there are beetles, there are moths, there are butterflies, there are flies, there are hummingbirds, there are bats, there are bees, there are ants, there are slugs, there are lemurs, there are lizards. There are a whole variety of different types of pollinators out there. Many of them we don't really deal with around here. Mostly we're going to focus on, specifically today, talking really about bees and butterflies. But when we think about grassland pollinators, because this is really what we're kind of focused on right now, what do they need? They need food. That's pollen and nectar plants. And for the caterpillars, they also need host plants, caterpillar food. A host plant is the plant that the caterpillar eats, and many caterpillars, from many butterflies and moths, are specialists on just certain types of plants that they can eat. For example, monarchs. The caterpillars can only eat milkweed. They can eat no other plants. So as I mentioned, there are those things. So when we look at food preferences and flower preferences, different pollinators prefer different flowers. And this is something which is called pollinator syndrome. It's kind of a general rule of thumb when we start looking at, what do pollinators require. So for example, if we look at the top line of this for the colors. So bees everyone sees in slightly different color ranges. So bees prefer bright white, yellow, blue, or if it reflects UV. When you're looking at a bird, for example, a hummingbird, you're looking at scarlet, orange, red, or white. So red flowers, if you're planting red flowers, it's not going to attract bees. And when you start looking at, planting, yellow flowers, it's not really going to attract birds. So each one really has different preferences. There are also different shapes, depending upon the style of nectar feeding, etc. But you can find this information general online, but it gives you a general idea. We need to kind of cover all the different bases if we're going to support pollinators. Now, three big terms I'll bring up today, because this is particular for bees. Bees are often defined by what they feed on. There are the terms polylectic, oligolectic, and monolectic, and this is only in reference to bees. So a polylectic bee is one that will take pollen and nectar from a whole variety of flowers. Think of honeybees. Honeybees and bumblebees are polylectic. You'll see them on all different types of flowers. Oligolectic, oligo meaning few, it's poly meaning many, oligo meaning few. They exhibit a narrow range. So you have bees that only focus on one family of flowers or one genus. And monolectic can be even more extreme, where you may have just a single species of flowering plants that bee specializes in. As an example, some of the specialist bees that we have around here, the southeastern blueberry bee, 90 to 95% of its diet for itself and its kids are blueberries, pollen, and nectar. Sweet potato vine bee, a specialist on sweet potato vines and morning glories. Hibiscus, specialist on hibiscus and its relatives. Squash bee, cucurbits. Sunflower bee, sunflower and its relatives. So if you plant other things outside of these groups, you will not get these bees. So we really need to also think about the specialist bees. Bees also prefer what they've kind of evolved with. So native bees prefer native plants over exotic plants. And you can see it very simply in this graph. This is looking at hedgerows, shrubs. So the black bar are native plants, the grayish bar are exotic, and you can see that the black bar is higher, in both new and mature hedgerows, that these are the preferences for native bees. So when you're looking at trying to attract native bees, thinking about native plants as opposed to the non-native. So conversely, if native bees prefer native plants, non-native bees prefer non-native plants, which only makes sense. It's non-native to us, but it's native to them. So all these plants that we like to plant because they look pretty, and also because we don't see anything eating them, which unfortunately means it's kind of a biological wasteland, all these non-native bees are preferring their native plants, which are non-native to us. So you can see that within the variety of species listed here, the non-native bees, the exotic bees, are preferring their exotic plants. When we start looking at prairie plants, prairie bees prefer prairie plants. Again, it's just reinforcing that whole idea. It's the native plants, and it's those found in those habitats that those bees have evolved with, which are preferential. So the circles on the right, that's more association with prairie plants. Oddly enough, the collettids, which are the polyester bees, they seem to like some of the exotic weedy plants. But in general, you're looking at native bees preferring, again, native plants. Now, how do bison fit in with this plant story? So bison are keystone species. They're ecosystem engineers. They increase overall biodiversity. So when we start looking at how they interact, we know that their interactions can help, wetland areas, because they don't tend to destroy, riparian habitats. Their grazing opens up habitat for prairie dogs, which opens it up for black-footed ferrets and everything associated with prairie dogs. So they are managing this whole system. They're supporting environmental health. They're creating patches. They're recycling nutrients. They're enhancing habitat quality, modifying fire regimes, create disturbances, dispersing plant seeds. We'll get into a few of these in a moment, and specifically how they're relating to pollinators. So what we're going to be talking about is how bison create and promote plant and floral diversity for pollinators. So one way they do this, they're seed dispersers. We tend to think of some of the seeds which are just kind of blown on the wind, grasses in particular, or if you've ever walked through a prairie and you get little seeds stuck to you. This happens to bison all the time. Their hair is adapted for these kind of native seeds, as the native seeds have adapted to their hair. So the graph on the left is really just showing that any age, calves, yearlings, adults, they're all spreading seeds. On the right, it's really looking at the issue of native versus non-native. So the native, in this particular case, are the gray bar. The non-native is the dark. And you can see that the native seeds are actually found more prevalently, more often in hair than the non-native. Again, it's that relationship that these plants have evolved a relationship with buffalo to disperse their seeds. Again, this is just showing, specifically looking at an analysis. This was a dissertation looking at seed dispersal by bison. Again, the gray bar is native plants, the dark bar are non-native plants. So whether you're looking at shed hair or clipped hair, you just have a much higher proportion of native plants versus non-native. So they're very instrumental. So we know that the bees prefer native plants, the native bees prefer native plants, and now bison, through their hair, are preferentially distributing native seeds. Well, how else do they create habitat? One of the ways they do that is how they graze. So bison, if they stay in one area for a prolonged period, they'll have heavy grazing. They'll really open up the habitat. A little bit lighter, they're just creating a short, grassland, to very little at all, creating more of a shrubby or taller habitat. So as bison move throughout their habitat, and traditionally this would have happened historically as bison migrated throughout various regions, they created this diverse group of habitats. Different birds, different bees, different animals, some like very short grass, some like medium. Some bird species actually require all three. When we look at species like prairie chickens, the males require that short grass in order for them to display to the females. They require the tall grass for the females to nest and lay their eggs, and then they prefer the mixed grass height for foraging, for taking those chicks through that. So bees, birds, a whole variety of species like the way that bison graze by producing these diverse habitats. And I know sometimes it gets tiresome looking at grass, but these really illustrative. Just look at the colors. The red line is bison grazing. The blue line is cattle grazing. So we know that bison graze, but we also know that cattle graze too, but they graze differently in how they move throughout the landscape, what plants they tend to feed preferentially on. So bison tend to eat more grasses and sedges than wildflowers. Cattle tend to eat all of those things. So the graphs on the left show that grass cover decreases with bison grazing more than with cattle, because cattle are feeding on everything, but bison are grazing more on grasses. So by removing the grasses, and then you look at the graph on the right, it increases that open space for more wildflowers, more diversity. So bison grazing compared to cattle increases overall diversity at both the what's called the plot scale, which means like right there where you're looking at it, to catchment, so a much larger landscape. So whether you're looking at a small scale or large scale, bison have that effect. This just shows it again. So the red line being bison, blue line being cattle. So on a small scale, bison increase that native species richness, and even on a larger scale, also increasing that diversity. So that diversity is both grasses and wildflowers. Now, why grasses? We don't tend to think of grasses as important for bees, but bees do collect grass pollen. So the image on the left is big blue stem, kind of shows the seed head. But on the right, if you look, that is actually corn. Corn is a grass. You look at the structure for the flowers where the pollen is, it looks very similar to our native grasses like big blue stem. And I've photographed many different types of bees collecting pollen. So in this particular case, a small sweat bee and two-spotted longhorn bee. We've replaced those grasses with corn, so they're just utilizing that. But historically and in natural habitats, they will also be collecting pollen from the grasses too. So grasses are one we don't tend to think about for supporting bees. We tend to think about wildflowers, but grasses are also very important too. Additionally, there are a number of butterflies which have grasses for their host, particularly skippers, the kind of little brown jobs of the butterfly world. When we talk about little brown jobs for birds, they're the smaller ones you tend to see flitting around. But little blue stem, big blue stem, switchgrass are hosts for skippers and of a variety of species. So that grass is important for both the bees and the butterflies. Now, as I mentioned too, by cattle feeding on the grasses and also creating diversity in grasses, they're opening up habitat for wildflowers too. And those wildflowers support a diversity of pollinators. So in this particular case, milkweed, as I mentioned, is the only host plant that monarch caterpillars can eat. So if you do not have milkweed, you do not have monarch butterflies. And we know that the monarch population has declined by upwards of 95% across North America. So we really need to have this diversity. The neat part about species like milkweed is that bees readily use it because it is a great nectar source. So in these particular cases, you can see a bumblebee on the top right, a small masked bee on the bottom, and a leafcutter bee on the top left. So all of these, because it's a really good nectar source, and actually bees are the most important pollinator for milkweed as opposed to monarch butterflies. So we've talked about food for the caterpillars. We've talked about the pollen and nectar for the adults. But one thing many people don't tend to think about, what else do bees require? They need a place to set up home, to raise their kids. They need a nesting site. So often when we create bee gardens or butterfly gardens, we think about just the flowers. We don't think about where they're going to raise their young. So bees have three main strategies. There are twig and tunnel nesters, where they nest in stems or tubes. They're the ground nesters, who nest literally in the ground, digging their holes. And then the large cavity nesters, which are the bumblebees, which use pre-existing holes, oftentimes old rodent burrows. That's where they will find a place to nest. So they're not digging their own hole, they're taking over one that's been abandoned. So bison, interestingly enough, it's been looked at, they support all of these different guilds, these different types of nesting. So in this particular case, again, all right, hit a few graphs, but really kind of shows that there is this science, there is this aspect about it. So the green line is bison present, the blue line is bison absent. So you can see in each of these cases, the green line is higher than the blue line. So where you have them, where you have bison, they're going to improve habitat far more than if they were absent. So whether you're looking at the twig and tunnel nesters, the ground nesters, or the large cavity nesters. So I want to get into a little bit about that biology. So about 70% of our native bees, and that's about 3,000 species of our 4,000 plus species in North America, are ground nesters. So when you see a hole in the ground, often people tend to think, oh, it's maybe an ant. But look to see if somebody's looking out, like this little fluorescent green metallic sweat bee in the bottom left, that's looking out, protecting the burrow, the entrance from either other bees coming in or flies or ants. But these species are nesting in the ground, and this is where they raise their young. And when I mentioned how bison grazing does a variety of things, it creates both short grass and tall grass and even some bare areas. So again, that grazing pressure, which opens up habitat for these ground nesting bees. And in certain habitat, it's going to be much more important. And I'll mention that in a moment. But here you can see that what I have circled in red are areas which have been grazed compared to areas not grazed. And you can see overall 2018 in this study was a bad year because it was just wet all over. So they really didn't get a good sample of bees. But you can see that where you had grazing. In this particular case, it's uh, cattle as a surrogate for bison, but it shows that grazing opens up that habitat for ground nesting bees. That's where I want to talk about a behavior that bison do that cattle do not, and this is wallowing. Many of you, if you've watched bison, they wallow. You know, I love watching bison wallow. It's just really cool. That wallowing does a variety of things. It increases plant and habitat diversity because you're creating a different habitat. They're often urinating and depositing dung. It creates a disturbance. It increases water availability, so plants which may require a little more water, uh, and also increases that diversity. It's also an aspect of disturbance. It's like if you dig a hole in your backyard, that is disturbance, and often one of the first plants that come in, one plant that's very often found in these disturbed areas around wallows is bee balm or wild bergamot, which is a great bee plant, genus Monarda. Bees love it, whether it's a really small bee like on the bottom, which is a small resin bee, to the bumblebees in the other pictures. It supports big bees, medium-sized bees, little bees. It's also a traditional uh, medicinal plant and tea. And also, if you drink Earl Grey tea, that is actually flavored with bergamot too. So we've even utilized this. But it's these habitats created by bison wallowing that opens up these habitat for sometimes unique flowers, which you don't tend to find in necessarily in some other areas. Historically, there would have been lots and lots of buffalo wallows on the landscape. Um, because the buffalo have disappeared, the wallows have disappeared, and sometimes some of these plants have also declined too. The act of wallowing also creates a bare site. And remember, we were talking about ground nesting bees, that it opens up a habitat for ground nesting bees and wasps. So one study that we published last year, looking at buffalo wallows in northeastern Montana around American Prairie, found that there are over 40 species of bees and wasps utilizing those habitats. In tallgrass prairie, and this paper is being submitted, um, Josh Klosterman found over 140 species, which actually kind of makes sense. If you look at a shortgrass prairie versus tallgrass, bare ground is much more limiting resource in tallgrass prairie because of tall grasses. The shortgrass prairie, you have a little more open space, allows for the bees to get into it. So across the range, that buffalo wallowing helps create nesting sites for these bees. Now, what about twig and tunnel nesting bees? So about 30% of our native bees are twig and tunnel nesters, about 1,000 species found in North America. They're usually using hollow stems, beetle boreholes in trees. So here's an example. This is actually, I created this stem. This is actually a cut stem from blackberry. This is a small carpenter bee. And on the right is a small carpenter bee on daisy fleabane. To give you an idea of the size, daisy fleabane, that flower is about the size of a dime. So it's a very small bee. So they're utilizing these individual stems. So as bison graze, creating these shortened stems for them to nest in, or as I mentioned, feeding on the grasses which leave these pithy stemmed wildflowers for these bees to nest are very important. Additionally, having that diversity with the leafcutter bees, the leafcutters, if you don't know, they are utilizing sections of leaf material to create their nests. So you can see this female on the right, she's sliced this nice little circular piece out of a leaf. She'll take that into that nest and basically creates a little cocoon out of leaves where she then puts some bee bread, which is a combination of pollen and nectar. The ground nesting bees do the same thing. They just don't usually have these leaves around it. And it lays an egg on there, and that young develops in that area. And you can tell, even in a garden, if you have leafcutter bees around, if you see these nice little circular oval cuts out of your flowers or leaves, this is not caterpillars, it's not beetles, these are leafcutter bees, and it really does not hurt the plant. You may think it does. So the picture on the top left is a rose bush at our house, and you can see it pretty much looks like lace. The leafcutter bees love it, but it comes back every single year and it blooms. So the bees are not detrimental. You may think it's aesthetically unpleasing, but you're allowing the bees to create their homes and raise their kids. So we need to learn how to kind of share reciprocally, even with our plants in the backyard. And then for some plants that are found in bison habitats, you have bees like this. This is the Carter bee, and the plant is white sage. White sage has this very hairy leaf and stem, this fuzz on it, which keeps it protected both from too much sun, also helps it from drying out. But what this bee does, it scrapes off the hair, and that's why they're called carder bees. They're carding the wool, and they use that to line their nest. And you can see in the nest on the right, it kind of looks like just cotton stuffed in there. But they're utilizing this both sacred plant and found in buffalo habitats, that buffalo are creating this diversity as another nesting material too. So they're creating both the stems for them to nest as well as the materials to line their nests with. Now, for the large cavity nesting bees, which are bumblebees, where you have bison, also again, preferentially next to cattle, you increase their overall diversity. Um, Now, overall prairie, of course, is supporting them. If you don't have prairie, we just have other types of grassland and bison, it's also supporting them. So this may be actually a relationship as both prairie and bison pastures are also supporting small rodent populations, and those rodent populations are creating their burrows, and when they abandon them after a year or so, then the bumblebees move in and raise their offspring. Another thing that bison do, uh, because we now have a problem, unfortunately, across a lot of the grasslands, is encroachment by woody plants. So here in Missouri and in the eastern plains, we have eastern red cedar, which is slowly encroaching on the grasslands. It would have historically been controlled by both fire and bison, because what bison do, they will graze on it, but they will also just rub on it. And never really thought about this. I just had a buffalo meeting this past week, and it was brought up by some indigenous people that this is actually tool use. We don't tend to think about this, but a bison using a a tree or a shrub to either itch itself, to clean its horns, to scratch its fur, to remove its fur, that is a form of tool use, which we don't tend to think about. But bison would have been able to kind of knock back the trees. And one study has shown that the Carter blue butterfly, which is an endangered species, is more prevalent in bison habitats because they open up the habitat. Because Carter blue butterflies actually prefer more of an oak savanna. So even in a partially wooded habitat, bison are incredibly important. So you can see that bison are really important in maintaining these habitats for pollinators. But why should we really care about pollinators? It's because many of them, for example, our wild bees, are at danger of going extinct or are in disappearing around across the range. This is two maps combined I put together. The background, which has the red and purple and blue squares, are counties where wild bees are at risk. The green I've overlaid as to kind of the general distribution of our temperate grasslands in the U.S. And you can see there's a large proportion of counties within those grasslands where bees are disappearing. So as we lose the grasslands, which were maintained by the bison, we're also losing those bee populations. And some species, like the American bumblebee, which is being proposed for listing on the Endangered Species Act, if you look at the range and where it's declined most, so red being the most uh, loss of them, with the kind of orangish next, and then orangish red, then orange. You can see also where those colors are corresponds fairly well to where we've lost grasslands. The nice part is Montana still has a lot of native grasslands there, so it's still green, but you can see in a lot of the central plains that this bee has been in decline. So I hope that kind of gives you an idea of the importance of bison as kind of structural components in the way of supporting pollinators. As I said, we don't tend to think about, we may talk about bison in with songbirds, grasslands, of course, and supporting them, but they are connected to so much of life. And the way bison graze, the way they interact with the plants, the way they disperse the seeds, are incredibly important for the overall diversity that we have in our grasslands, our mixed, tall, and short grass prairies. So bison are instrumental. Remember, they are keystone species, they're ecosystem engineers, and we all depend on them, and particularly the bees and the butterflies. And with that, I thank you and open it up for any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you so much. That was really informative. I was really looking forward to this talk specifically, and I feel like I learned a lot. So thank you for that. Does anyone have any questions before I get started? Of course, I have some.
Yeah, hi Ed. You had talked about the different nesting behaviors of
Mhm.
bees.
Yeah.
Um, and I was curious about because for example, the ground nesting, the difference between absent bison or presence of bison was not as big of a difference as compared to I forget what the twig
Yeah.
um, in the middle graph.
Right.
Um, so I was curious, I guess, what are the behaviors in bison that specific like real world, uh, what is different about absent bison versus present bison, I guess, for twigs, for like why is that so prevalent?
Yeah, so for that, it's really the grazing strategy
Okay.
that bison have. So 'cause think about it in two ways. One is that they are opening up this habitat for the stems, and the stems that these bees are utilizing are the thicker, pithy stem plants. So think of things like goldenrod. Goldenrod is a great example that it is a pithy stem plant. Um, even some of those smaller shrubs, I said, like raspberry or blackberry or hydrangea, but these sunflowers also have a bit of a pithy stem too. By creating and opening up habitat for these wildflowers with thicker stems, that creates habitat. Additionally, the way they will often graze, so occasionally just in their movement or grazing patterns, they will kind of cut off the stem. So some of the bees will literally chew through the side and go in. Others require that broken end and use that as the opening to get in. So both their movement, walking through the grasslands, their feeding behavior, is really focusing on the uh, the twig and tunnel nesters. As you mentioned too, it's not as prevalent with the ground nesting bees in a lot of the habitats. It does show an increase in ground nesting bees, but there it's really if it's a heavy grazing or if it's the wallowing behavior in particular really supports that. And if you go out to areas where bison have no longer exist, but you'll see remnants of all of these old buffalo wallows. You can see that once there were all of these areas that were utilized at one time would have been by ground nesting bees. Also, they would have held water, supporting amphibians. Uh, and interestingly enough, buffalo too actually prefer to drink water from these standing pools as opposed to having to move to a water resource like a river or stream. So historically, when you had all these buffalo wallows, it actually allowed them to move more gradually through the landscape as opposed to when we think about cattle, going to the river, coming back, going to the river, coming back. They preferentially prefer. So these wallows serve so many purposes that we have forgotten about that, for whether it's the bees or amphibians or other wildlife or just for the bison themselves, whether their behavior or for their own water resources. It's been, a resource that unfortunately has disappeared across the grasslands.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Hi, Ed. I also had a question. Um, so going back to bee habitats and creating
Mhm.
them for them, um, would you recommend the use of like the bee hotels and bug hotels? And would you also kind of recommend making a little wallow spot for the ground dwelling bees?
Yes, and I've done them both. So bee hotels, and there are a number of companies which sell them. The biggest issue you need to look at with bee hotels is the depth of the hole. So some of them are designed with pre-drilled holes. Some of them are just a space that you fill with tubes, and you can buy a lot of different cardboard tubes or Phragmites reeds to put in there. But you really need to make sure on the depth. So general rule of thumb is if, well, first I should get back. Each of these bees are different sizes, so they'll like different size holes. So for example, the first bee hotel I ever made was with a 4x4, which if you know anything about a 4x4 is actually 3.5 by 3.5. So then you're making basically a 3.25 inch hole, so it doesn't go all the way through. But I made some holes just an 1/8 inch in diameter, and mask bees will utilize that. And if at any time later on, if you want me to give a talk on planting for bees, I'm happy to do that too. Uh, but if you're looking at a hole that's less than 1/4 inch deep, it should be at least 1/4 inch in diameter. It should be at least 3 to 4 inches deep. If it's 1/4 inch or more, it should be at least 5 to 6 inches deep. Now, some of the newer bee hotels, and it used to be you always find these really short ones, but now pretty much most of them are of the proper depth. The reason you want that depth is because bees determine the sex of their offspring depending upon whether they fertilize the egg or not. If the egg is fertilized, it's a female. If it's not fertilized, it's a male. So the female can actually determine the sex of her offspring. And the way they will often lay their eggs in the tubes is the females are in back, the males are in front, because the males are more expendable. So if anything comes in the front, whether a woodpecker digging through or a predator or a wasp, you can easily lose a few males. They can mate with several females. The females are much more important. So having those in back. But if you shorten the length of the tube, then it's kind of a what is the best strategy to pass on your genes? So if you have limited resources, and there's a lot of modeling and studies looking at this, is it better to have a daughter or a son if you only have one or the other? If you just have one daughter, that's a lot of effort that they have to put in to raise one or several offspring. If you have a son, they can potentially inseminate several different females. So what will often happen is if the hole is too short, there'll be more males than females. So you can actually skew the sex ratio. So you want to make sure that the hole is deep enough. So there are a number of really good bee hotels now, and we use them at home. I've also given them to some of the tribes to use around their orchards, etc. So that's very important. And then creating that bare ground space. Now you can just do it naturally, or sometimes what I've done is uh, delineate it so you know that this is that bare space that you're saving for the bees. And I've done it in two ways. One, where I've just dug down into the ground, basically put a kind of a wooden frame around it, just 2x10s, and then backfilled with the dirt. And I added a little sand too. Now, different bees like different, some like it really hard to compact, some like it sandy. So you can experiment. But it just shows that that's there. I've also done it as basically a raised bed. So just create a raised bed like you do gardening, fill it with dirt, but don't plant anything in it, and just allow the bees. And bees have used both of those. So you can either just kind of scrape away. Another method is if you are doing some gardening or work on a farm or whatever else, and if you create this dirt mound, they'll utilize those too.
Okay. Thank you. Follow-up question.
Mhm.
Do they need to be your bee hotels or your bare ground spots, do they need to be um separated? Because the bees might try to fight for territory, or would they
No,
all just happen to get along?
no. So some of the ground nesting bees they nest alone, but they don't really care what's around them. Others will nest in aggregations. So like Calides inequalis, which is a spring polyester bee, that you'll find them in huge aggregations. And the one thing that people tend to worry a little bit about is, oh, am I going to get stung? Now, what I tell people, as an example, if you run your lawnmower over a yellow jacket nest, which is a wasp, you'll get stung. If you
Hmm.
run it over a ground nesting bee, they're just annoyed with you. Now they're spending their time trying to find the hole that you may have just buried. And that's actually, I found our first uh, agapostum ground nesting bee in our backyard. I was just mowing the lawn, and then I suddenly saw this pile of dirt. My first thought was actually ants, but then I saw this lone bee circling the hole, circling the hill, trying to find the hole that I just unfortunately, covered up. They don't really care. So when you have something like Calides inequalis, and several years ago, one of our horticulture staff um, told us about it, which unfortunately their pest person misidentified. But I went out there, and this area was probably at least 30 by 30 feet right next to their driveway, and it was just covered. About every, I don't know, maybe every 6 inches, there was a hole. So
Okay.
all of these bees, and I'm crawling around on the ground, photographing them. They could have cared less about me, but they're only out for a short time. You have to remember too that bees as an adult are only around for about 6 weeks. So whether we're thinking about honeybees, bumblebees, the other bees, now what honeybees are, they have a multi-generational, they produce a lot of kids. So that's why you see them all year round. Bumblebees, the queens come out in the spring, start their colony. You see them all during the summer and the fall. They produce their new queens, and then the rest of the colony dies. But like the spring polyester bee, the adults are only out for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you don't see them again until next year. It is really dedicated to spring. So that's why also if you're planting too, I also recommend this. And in a natural habitat, you'd have this. You need to make sure you have spring, summer, and fall covered, because some bees are only active in spring, some are only active in summer, some are only active in fall. So think of things like the sunflower bee. They're only out when the sunflowers are in bloom. You don't see them at any other time. So the blueberry bee, only when the blueberries are in bloom, and that's a spring plant. So yeah, thinking about those seasons too is important.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great questions. Thank you, everyone. I have a few bison related questions, and the first one is kind of random. So if you don't know the answer, that's okay. But on the chart where it showed like calves, yearlings, and adults for seed dispersal, when they were adults, the females had a higher seed dispersal than the males. Do you know why that would be?
Yeah, so there's a few studies looking at resource allocation, by them. And I think probably the biggest one is when you start looking at adults, and I forgot how they actually define them. Think about during the rut in particular. So during the rut, the males aren't really getting into the food, they're not really grazing, they're just focused on reproduction. So in that particular case, they're not interacting with the plants as readily as the females would be constantly. So there are some studies looking at, is there a dietary and ecological separation between young and adults and both females and males? And you do see this because there's a slightly different feeding regime, what the males require, particularly after the rut, to kind of bring back their body condition. So I think that is a major driving point that differs between the females and adult males.
That's so cool. That's fascinating. Um, And then I had kind of a dual part question, which goes also in line with what Faith was asking. But what are some common mistakes that people make when trying to help pollinators versus like what is the best thing someone can do to help pollinators?
I think the most common mistake is not thinking about the seasons.
Okay.
Think about how people tend to interact with their garden. They tend to, it's summer vacation or the kids are home during the summer. You tend to think about summer. So you have a lot of stuff blooming in the summer, but the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, people don't tend to think about. The biggest issue, especially in spring, now there are a lot of good spring, perennials and annuals. We have all this daisy fleabane that I allow to grow up in the lawn, and I just mow around it. Virginia bluebells, but a lot of the most important spring plants are actually trees and shrubs. So things like wild plum, chokeberry, redbud, all these things are. But people tend to be hesitant about planting a shrub. Serviceberry is a great one. And it gets sometimes people get a little concerned when they read the descriptions online. So, for example, serviceberry, it'll often say 20 to 25-foot tree. I've never had a serviceberry get that big. They'll ours is now 7, 8 years old. and it's a max of about 12 feet. It's never really gone anywhere beyond that, too. Even our plums, really haven't gone beyond that kind of, height, too. So, but thinking about those spring uh, plants, I think is one that people forget about. There's also this misconception about some plants causing hay fever. Goldenrod is a classic example. So people don't want to plant goldenrod because they think it causes hay fever or it becomes it's too aggressive. Now, Canada goldenrod, yes, it can be very aggressive, but there are a lot of good short, like rigid and gray, and cliff goldenrod that are not very aggressive. But this impression that goldenrod causes hay fever goes back a long time. So, think about when, allergy companies are trying to sell you, buy our medicine. Now they could show you all this green because the ragweed is blooming at the same time as the goldenrod, but it doesn't make a really attractive commercial or a good label on a package. So you show these flowers. So you get that misimpression. Additionally, for most people, they see the goldenrod, but they don't see the ragweed, which is wind pollinated. Goldenrod requires bees and other pollinators. Think of flowers as billboards, signposts that attract a pollinator. You know, if it's got a flower, it needs something to move the pollen. Grasses, which are nondescript green, it's wind pollinated. That's what's causing the hay fever. Yeah, and as I said, this story goes back a long time. I remember years ago, I was just flicking through TV stations and I found this one movie. I still forget to look up what the name was, but the premise of the movie was that this girl's grandfather had passed away and been reincarnated as a racehorse. And she knew it was her grandfather because the horse sneezed around goldenrod because her grandfather sneezed around goldenrod. So first off, you have this idea that, yeah, goldenrod causes hay fever. No, it doesn't. But now you're telling that broader story. So, you know, understanding that if it's got a flower, it's attracting pollinators. The other one that people get concerned about and is the whole idea of getting stung. And so people are very leery. This particularly happens with schools, where you tell a school, well, why don't you put in a pollinator garden or a butterfly garden for the kids? Oh, that's a great idea. Well, why don't you put in a bee garden? Oh, we're going to get a lawsuit. Well, you put in a flower, you're going to get a bee. it's, uh, we just are very upfront about it. But when a bee is on a flower, all it cares about is pollen and nectar, just eating and drinking. Just like if you're at lunch or dinner, all you think about is eating and drinking, not hitting anybody, hopefully. Same thing with a bee. It's much easier being around them. Additionally, like if you're, at a mall during Christmas and you start swinging your arms around, someone's bound to hit you. Same thing, you just start swinging your arms around some bees, someone's bound to hit you. So you treat the bees like you would want to be treated, and there really is no issue. So people just get, concerned that, oh, I don't want to do this. They don't tend to think about the seasons. Or the other is, I don't have any space to do it properly. The great thing about it, you can use a container. Start in a container. If you've got, 1,000 acres or you only have a patio with a few containers, every little bit helps to help pollinators. So I think the biggest one is, oh, I don't have the space to start. Everybody usually has some space to start.
Wow. I like that. Okay, does anyone have any last questions? We have a few minutes left. If not, that's okay. I just wanted to double check. Okay, you can interrupt me too if I'm asking this and you think of one. So about bison and pollinators, were there any findings in your research that surprised you, that you were like, oh, I did not expect this?
That's a good question. I mean, I could always kind of assumed that there was this. I think what surprised me is that somebody actually studied it. I think that's usually the biggest question. It's like, well, you think this would happen, but has anybody actually looked at this? It's like, oh, yeah. But like the buffalo wallows, this is all very new research. There's a number of papers on buffalo wallows and plants and soil, but the first one published on ground nesting is the one we published last year.
Wow.
And then the other one, hopefully, will be published this year in tallgrass prairie. These are fairly new studies, so it's ones we don't tend to think about. I think that's the biggest one. But I think, there's a lot of other studies looking out there, which I did incorporate to try to get even more connections. Um, but when you really started looking at the intricacies and how buffalo are connected to so many things, it's amazing. And as I said, um, for example, with the wallows, I didn't bring up, but they've looked at the buffalo wallow and increase in arthropod diversity. So looking at grasshoppers, predators, I was just focusing on bees and butterflies, but those wallows also increase those other species too. So what was most amazing is that I could find someone that has done some research. I think that was the most surprising thing. And then, but that leads to more questions. So, for example, the prevalence of different plants. What is this one I'm not seeing. So you have a buffalo wallow, which creates this disturbance, and you have things like bergamot and coneflower coming up along the edges. Does that stay? So when that buffalo wallow is abandoned and it starts filling with other grasses, do those plants stay? Does it maintain that diversity? And we're actually going to try doing some of this with students up at Anninakota College on Fort Belknap, looking at, you know, active and inactive buffalo wallows and looking at some of the plant diversity between both of them.
That's so cool. What a cool job. I love it. Okay, so my final question, I know that you spoke about how the grasslands are, they're in danger and the bees are in danger. But is there what gives you hope right now in pollinator conservation?
I think the amount of people that are, talking about it, and I think getting different people together. So the one group that I'm co-chairing is the Safe North American Grasslands Coalition. So, as you mentioned, I co-lead the Safe North American Bison program, but that's just bison. There are all of these other species within grasslands. And within the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, there are all these other safe programs. Can we bring them all together and work across taxa? So that program, that coalition includes American burying beetle, prairie butterfly, monarch butterfly, eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, Wyoming toad, whooping crane, Atwater's prairie chicken, North American songbirds, freshwater mussels, Mexican wolf, red wolf, probably missing something there, and also swift fox. So can we bring everyone together to really tell that story? And places like yourself, the Discovery Center and zoos, we have the guests coming through, and there are groups like World Wildlife Fund, TNC, and others who are trying to create a grasslands campaign. And they're going to go out to some media, they'll go out to their membership, but you and I have people coming through. We can get in their face, and talk about these things. As I say, like any zoo will probably have a songbird or a monarch flying through. Can you use that opportunity to tell the buffalo story? Can you tell other pollinator stories? Can you tell black-footed ferret story, etc.? Oh, black-footed ferret's a part of the site program too. But I think people are now willing and eager to try to come together, as opposed to everyone being in their own silos before. I think that gives me hope, and it's also something you have to have hope. If you're in conservation, you have to be an optimist. Otherwise, give it up, be a broker on Wall Street, just try to make as much money as possible, and then try to die with all your money still intact. But so I think for a person who cares about conservation, you have to have some optimism one way or another.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful message, everyone coming together. And I think, well, it started a few years ago, but there is a big movement to save the bees, and pollinators. And I think that's really cool that even people like myself who don't know anything about bees are in it, we're interested. So I think that is really hopeful. Thank you for that. Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Ed, for your time on a Saturday. Thank you guys for tuning in. As I said, this will be on our website if you ever want to reference back to any of the handy tips and information that was shared today. But thank you again, and I hope we can have another talk on planting for bees, as you said.
You're
All
very
right,
welcome.
thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.